On April 3, 2020, the White House issued a statement that said, "America is at war with an invisible enemy." That enemy is a respiratory illness called new coronavirus, and it has enveloped the country and much of the world in a pandemic. And to fight it, President Donald Trump has issued a series of memoranda, executive orders, and other measures that have compelled companies to make medical supplies and that have cracked down on what the president calls wartime profiteering. What is giving him this unusual control over private companies and individuals is a 70-year-old piece of wartime legislation called the Defense Production Act.
We will continue to uphold, and if necessary, to defend with arms the principles of the United Nations.
It is about time, say many politicians, federal and otherwise, who had complained the government was slow to use its power to address the crisis.
The president said it's a war. It is a war. Well, then act like it's a war.
For weeks, Trump appeared to resist calls to invoke the act, saying that to do so would be tantamount to nationalizing large portions of the U.S. economy. Indeed, the Defense Production Act does grant Trump expanded powers over the U.S. domestic economy, allowing the president to direct companies to produce needed goods, including face masks, ventilators, and virus testing kits, outlaw the hoarding or export of scarce supplies, and potentially take other actions extraordinary for a president. After weeks of criticism from lawmakers and state governors claiming he was dragging his feet, President Trump said on April 19th he would use the act to increase production of swabs needed for virus testing kits.
We're calling in the Defense Production Act, and we'll be getting swabs very easily. Swabs are easy. Ventilators are hard.
The swabs and other testing materials have been in critically short supply in the United States. Reports indicate the U.S. had been testing far fewer people than many other countries, even when adjusting for population size. In the days that followed, the Department of Defense announced contracts with some companies to make virus testing materials. Politicians, public health experts, and others have said leadership is also needed to coordinate the development of a vaccine for the virus, which is a complex process that could take years. The president's power under the DPA could be used to make and distribute vaccines. To understand why leaders on both sides of the political fence would support using a wartime law to fight a disease, it helps to look at what the Defense Production Act is and how it has been used since it was made law over a half-century ago. President Harry Truman first signed the Defense Production Act into law in 1950, when the United States was embroiled in the Korean War.
If we were to do these things, we would be enmeshed in a vast conflict on the continent of Asia, and our task would become immeasurably more difficult all over the world.
The act was intended to address concerns over potential shortages of needed supplies. The law was modeled on the War Acts of 1941 and 1942, which gave then-President Franklin Delano Roosevelt broad power over the U.S. economy during World War II. The DPA gave Truman an exceptional set of tools to control the economy, including the power to set wages and prices, and the power to ration goods. Since that time, the law has been reauthorized under several presidents. The Defense Department uses it all the time to push companies to prioritize federal projects, using it to place about 300,000 orders per year, according to a report from the Department of Homeland Security. And it isn't just used for defense. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, has used the DPA to place and expedite orders for emergency supplies during natural disasters, such as hurricanes. These can include medical supplies and even bottled water. But these orders tend to be fewer in number than those made for defense. The Department of Homeland Security, including FEMA, only file about 2,000 orders per year. About half of those were made for disaster preparedness, response, and recovery, according to the DHS. The Department of Energy even used the DPA in 2001 during the California energy crisis, according to a report by the Congressional Research Service. But it is extraordinary for a president to use the law to combat a pandemic. As the coronavirus began spreading throughout the U.S., lawmakers pleaded with the Trump administration to invoke the DPA to ensure needed medical and protective equipment were reaching healthcare workers, patients, and other citizens. The president said in a press conference on March 18th that he would use the DPA to address supply shortages.
So we will be invoking the Defense Production Act. Last week, I signed an emergency declaration under the Stafford Act.
However, later comments from Trump and other members of the administration appeared to contradict that. In a subsequent press conference, the president likened the use of the act to nationalizing industries.
Using it's actually a big deal because basically what are you doing? You're talking about you're going to nationalize an industry, or you're going to nationalize, you're going to take away companies, you're going to tell companies what to do.
But by early April, the administration took several actions invoking the DPA to combat the pandemic. Trump ordered General Motors, the largest U.S. automotive manufacturer, to make ventilators, devices used to help people breathe. Auto industry analysts and General Motors itself said the company had already been working with ventilator maker Ventec Life Systems prior to the order from the president. President Trump had accused General Motors of taking too long to fill the order and pushing for too high a price.
GM was actually very early in announcing their plans to do what they could to help medical responders to get the supplies that they needed during this crisis. Even before there was any discussion of using the DPA, said that they were getting their purchasing and supply chain teams lined up, talking to the companies that normally produce this equipment, and then going out to their supply chain to figure out, okay, what can we do? Because clearly you can't just take a car assembly plant and flip a switch and suddenly start making ventilators.
General Motors said on April 14th it had begun mass production of the ventilators made in partnership with Ventec. At the time, it planned to ship more than 600 ventilators in April, fill half the government's order by June, with the rest by the end of August. The president also ordered U.S. industrial firm 3M to redirect its supplies of N95 respirator masks, which are especially effective at filtering out very fine particles, including bacteria. 3M is said to be one of the largest makers of N95 masks in the world. After the White House gave the order pushing 3M to divert more of its mask and personal protective equipment to fight the virus, the president took to Twitter saying, "We hit 3M hard today after seeing what they were doing with their masks." 3M CEO Mike Roman pushed back on the criticism.
The idea that 3M is not doing all it can to fight price gouging and unauthorized reselling is absurd. The narrative that we are not doing everything we can to maximize delivery of respirators in our home country, nothing could be further from the truth. We are doing everything we can to maximize our efforts and to fight COVID-19 and to support the healthcare workers here at home in the U.S.
On April 21st, the Department of Defense awarded $133 million combined in contracts to 3M, O&M Halliward, and Honeywell to produce 39 million more N95 masks over 90 days, and tens of millions more in the months that follow. The president also invoked the DPA in an executive order to prevent hoarding of scarce goods and issued a memorandum to prevent the export of such materials overseas. That includes face masks and other personal protective equipment. The president has further powers under the act. For example, the government can loan money directly to companies for the purposes of making or delivering needed materials or services, and the government can guarantee loans made by non-federal lenders, meaning the government will pay back the loan if the borrower cannot. The president can also hire people with outstanding experience to address the crisis and establish a volunteer pool of industry executives who could be called on for government service. Federal government can also set up partnerships with companies or permit partnerships among companies that might normally run afoul of antitrust laws. On March 27th, the president invoked some of these powers in an order giving several medical equipment companies resources to remove supply chain obstacles. Trump has also used the DPA to take actions that aren't directly related to combating the virus. On April 28th, he signed an executive order to keep meat processing plants open during the pandemic.
With the meat packing and with the transportation, we have had some difficulty where they're having a liability that's really unfair to them. It's getting drawn up. I should be signing that over the next hour or so, taking the liability, which frees up the entire system.
Closure of meat and poultry processing plants can quickly have an outsized impact on our nation's food supply chain, the White House said. Of course, the White House's use of the DPA and some of the president's rhetoric have both received criticism from various camps. On the heels of steady criticism claiming the White House was not doing enough to combat the scarcity of virus test kits, the president said on April 19th he would use the DPA to counteract the shortage. The US had long lagged behind other countries in coronavirus testing. Two desperately needed materials are swabs, which are used to collect samples from patients' noses and mouths, and reagents, chemicals needed to test the samples for the virus. President Trump said the government contracted with one factory to produce 20 million swabs a month and another to produce 10 million swabs per month. On April 29th, the Department of Defense announced a $75.5 million contract with swab maker Puritan Medical Products to increase swab production by 20 million per month starting in May. Politicians on both sides of the aisle, along with health experts and business executives, have all said in recent weeks there are not enough tests available and that more are needed before the government can begin lifting restrictions and reopening the economy. State governors have spoken publicly about the scarcity of needed testing materials and pushed back against comments from the Trump administration that the country has enough testing capacity to begin relaxing restrictions. Maryland's Republican Governor Larry Hogan, who chairs the National Governors Association, has repeatedly said inadequate access to testing is the biggest problem the country faces since the pandemic hit. Michigan's Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer had called on Trump to use the DPA to boost production of needed materials.
That if the federal government would use the Defense Production Act and say we're going to make every swab people need and we're going to expedite creation of the reagents, we would be able to know how prevalent COVID-19 is. It would take down the risk associated with taking actions to re-engage parts of our economy because we would have a lot more data about how prevalent COVID-19 still is in our states.
The federal government came close to using the DPA to secure test kits in the past, but it backed off. FEMA had said in late March it might use the DPA to obtain needed kits, but a spokesperson for FEMA later said the agency had received the kits it needed without invoking the law. Others have also called for the president to use the DPA to develop vaccines against the virus, something the law does give him the power to do. A World Health Organization document identified 70 potential coronavirus vaccines in development around the world. But creating a vaccine could take at least a year to a year and a half, said Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. Some health experts have said even that is optimistic. Historically, it is not unusual at all for vaccine development to take 10 to 15 years or more. Sometimes development can happen faster than that. Pharmaceutical company Merck acquired the rights to a vaccine for Ebola in 2014, when the Ebola virus was at its peak in Western Africa. The company finally won approval for the vaccine in the European Union and the US in 2019, 5 years later. Just creating the vaccine is difficult and time-consuming enough. There have to be several phases of trials and experimentation. This process alone could take a year or more. But then there's the problem of manufacturing the vaccine and distributing it. Vaccines are typically manufactured in quantities of a few million to 10 or 20 million a year at most, said R. Gordon Douglas, a vaccine production expert. Most of those are routine vaccines given to newborn babies or the elderly.
The Defense Production Act or something similar to it would be very useful here because as I see it, even if one company develops a vaccine, it's very unlikely that one company alone is going to be able to make 700 million doses of a vaccine. And so we're going to need several companies. One company might develop a vaccine. This is what was done with polio. Polio vaccine was developed, and then several manufacturers started making it. That worked well. That could be done again. It would require some government action that would allow these companies to work together on this common goal at the time of a national emergency.
The highest volume vaccine in any given year is the seasonal flu vaccine, which is made in a quantity of about 150 million, less than half the total population of the United States. And there are typically several companies working on seasonal flu vaccines in any given year and bringing all their manufacturing capacity to bear. So there are few, if any, examples of vaccines deployed at the kind of scale needed to immunize the entire country from coronavirus.
It's a complex bioengineering as well as a scientific and technological problem. But it can be done. We have the expertise. We have all the expertise in this country to do this job if they can be brought together. All of those little things have to be put together. It's not just one item. It's a multitude of things. I think that we really need a vaccine czar that could allow that person to manage this in a sophisticated way so that we get to the end game as fast as possible.
Furthermore, it is often not possible to make a new vaccine using machinery and processes designed for an existing one. Vaccines are made through sometimes very different processes, and factories need to be tailored to manufacture different types. So a manufacturer might have to build an entirely new factory, which could take around 2 years. Then there would have to be an effort to begin immunizing people, which could take months. All said, it could take at least 2 years or more, even if expedited, Douglas said. But to do that would take leadership and coordination. Public health experts have said there needs to be some kind of vaccine czar at the federal level who can coordinate the extremely complex effort. The DPA gives the president that power. The president also has the power under the DPA to, say, allow different pharmaceutical companies to collaborate on the development and manufacture of a vaccine without risking antitrust violations, something that could very well be needed given manufacturing constraints. Of course, since the president began invoking the act, some in Congress want him to go even further. In late March, Senator Chuck Schumer called on Donald Trump to use his power under the DPA to appoint a coronavirus czar and renewed his call again in early April. Schumer said he did not think the country would be able to solve its medical supply problem unless the government appoints someone from the military who understands command and control, logistics, and similar strategies and tactics that can rapidly and smoothly get supplies where they are most needed. Trump has fired back at Schumer's calls, saying he has already appointed military personnel to coordinate the response. One thing is clear though, politicians are speaking of the fight against the pandemic as a kind of war effort.